My name is Lauren Whitaker. I'm 29 years old, and the most humiliating moment of my life happened at my own mother's baby shower brunch in Charlotte, when my sister Tessa dumped a full mimosa down the front of my dress on purpose, then shoved me hard enough to stumble into the gift table, all because I wouldn't fix her finances again in private. It wasn't an accident. That's the part people still try to soften when they retell it. They say, "Oh, you know how crowded those things get." Or, "Maybe she was just emotional." No. I watched her eyes lock onto mine first, cold, calculating, before her hand tipped the glass. Orange and champagne poured over my chest like a cheap prank in a movie. I heard the wet slap of fabric, the collective gasp of 80-some guests packed into my parents' gated townhouse living room, and then Tessa's voice, loud and sweetly vicious, cutting straight through the shock. "Oops," she sang, and then, like she was performing for an audience, she added, "Lauren always has to make everything about her." My cheeks burned so fast I could taste it. I looked down at myself, pale blue wrap dress, ruined, sticky, clinging in all the wrong places. The brunch table was still covered in pastel balloons and tiny frosted cupcakes. There were diaper raffle tickets in a bowl. My mother had spent the morning fussing over a balloon arch that said, "Welcome, baby," and there I was, standing in the middle of it, smelling like spilled alcohol, while my sister's friends stared at me like I was the problem. I opened my mouth to speak, but Tessa stepped in close, shoulder-checking me. Not gently, not like siblings brushing past each other. It was a shove, with intention, sharp enough that my heel caught on the edge of a gift bag and I lurched sideways into the stack of boxes. Tissue paper exploded into the air. A framed ultrasound photo slid off a table and cracked in half on the floor. That's when my mother moved, fast, decisive, straight toward the ultrasound frame. "Oh my God," she hissed, scooping it up like it was a wounded bird. She didn't look at my drenched dress. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't even glance at the red spot blooming on my arm where the table corner had clipped me. She just stared at the crack in the glass like it was my fault. "Lauren," she snapped, eyes flashing. "Apologize. Right now. You ruined this." I remember blinking at her, genuinely confused for half a second because I was the one standing there soaked and shoved. I turned, searching for my dad, Dean, hoping for even a flicker of fairness. He was by the kitchen doorway with a paper plate in his hand, jaw tight, looking anywhere but at me. "Elaine, it was," I started. My sister cut me off with a shaky little laugh that sounded rehearsed. "She's been jealous my whole pregnancy," Tessa said, loud enough for everyone. "She can't stand that something isn't about her for once." People shifted uncomfortably. Someone murmured, "Oh, honey," and I couldn't tell if it was meant for me or for her. I felt my stomach go hollow, like an elevator dropping, because this wasn't just a scene. It was a message, a public reminder of what I'd been taught my whole life. Tessa gets protected, I get managed. My mom grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the hallway like she was dragging a misbehaving child out of church. Her nails dug in. She leaned close, voice low and furious. "Not here," she hissed. "Do you understand me? Not in front of everyone." I looked over my shoulder at the guests, the pastel decor, the shiny smiles, the phones half raised, like people couldn't decide whether to help or film. Tessa had already slipped into a chair like a queen returning to her throne, dabbing at fake tears with a napkin. And right then, with my dress soaked and my arm throbbing, I realized something that hit harder than the shove. They weren't scared I'd embarrass them. They were scared I'd finally stop paying for them. I didn't say another word. I just pulled my wrist free, walked out the front door, and let the spring air hit my sticky skin like a slap of its own. because somewhere underneath the humiliation, a colder feeling was waking up. One I'd been avoiding for years. One that was already making plans. If you had asked anyone in my family growing up, they would have told you that Tessa was the star and I was the practical one. That was the polite version of the story they liked to tell their friends. Tessa was loud, charming, beautiful in a way that drew attention the moment she entered a room. Teachers adored her. Boys followed her around like satellites. My mom called her the light of the family, which was a phrase I heard so often it eventually stopped sounding strange. And me? I was the responsible one, the one who got straight A's without anyone asking. The one who quietly handled problems before they grew big enough to embarrass the family. I used to think that was a compliment. Looking back now, it was more like a job description. By the time I was 27, I had already built a stable career running operations for a logistics technology company in downtown Charlotte. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and profitable. My days were filled with spreadsheets, contracts, and negotiations with people who respected the numbers more than emotions. Meanwhile, Tessa had gone through what my dad called her exploration years. There had been a boutique candle business that lasted 8 months, a lifestyle blog that ended after she forgot to post for 3 weeks. Then came the newest venture, her medical staffing agency. Tessa loved telling people she was empowering women in healthcare, and honestly, it sounded impressive enough that most people didn't question it. What they didn't know was how that business actually started. 3 years earlier, my parents had sat across from me at a small Italian restaurant near my office. My mom barely touched her pasta the entire night. My dad kept rubbing the back of his neck like he had something uncomfortable to say. Finally, my mother leaned forward. "Lauren," she said gently, "your sister just needs a little help getting started." That phrase, "a little help," ended up costing me more than $400,000. I funded the startup through 2 promissory notes and helped set up the company structure. Legally, everything was documented. The contracts were precise, and the repayment conditions were clear. But inside our family, none of that paperwork mattered. To them, it wasn't a loan. It was proof that I loved them. A year later, another request came. This time, it was about housing. My parents' old house had been sold during a messy refinancing situation that my father never fully explained. They needed somewhere temporary while they figured things out. I ended up purchasing a renovated end-unit townhouse in a gated neighborhood through one of my LLCs. The plan was simple. They could live there rent-free for a year. That year quietly stretched into 3. At every holiday dinner, every birthday brunch, every family barbecue, my mother told people the same version of the story. "We're so proud of both our daughters," she would say warmly. But the way she said Tessa's name always carried more shine. Tessa, the entrepreneur. Tessa, the soon-to-be mother. Tessa, the one everyone needed to support. And me? I was just Lauren, the dependable one, the one who paid the bills and didn't make scenes. Looking back, there were warning signs everywhere. Late-night texts from Tessa asking for quick transfers to cover payroll. Emails from vendors I had never heard of. My mother occasionally calling to say, "Your sister's under a lot of stress right now." But I kept believing the same lie that had guided me my entire life, that helping family would eventually be appreciated. The baby shower in April was supposed to be a celebration. My mother had been planning it for weeks. She rented pastel tablecloths, hired a catering service, and invited nearly everyone she knew. Neighbors, church friends, Tessa's business contacts. 86 guests filled that townhouse. I arrived with a gift bag that held a custom oak crib I had ordered months earlier. I thought I was showing support. Now I realized something else. That brunch wasn't a celebration. It was the first stage of a performance Tessa had already planned, and I had walked right into it. I drove home from the baby shower still smelling faintly like champagne and orange juice. Even after a long shower and 2 cycles in the washing machine, the sticky sweetness clung to my dress, like a reminder I couldn't rinse away. But the physical mess wasn't what kept replaying in my mind. It was the look on Tessa's face right before she tipped the glass. That small, deliberate smile. The next morning was Monday, and like most Mondays, I arrived at my office downtown a little before 8. The building was already humming with quiet activity, keyboards clicking, the coffee machine grinding beans in the break room, the soft murmur of early meetings behind glass walls. Normally, work helped me compartmentalize things. Numbers were easier than emotions. Contracts didn't twist the truth. But that morning, I couldn't focus. By 9:30 a.m., my phone had already lit up with 3 missed calls from my mother and 2 texts from my father. Mom, we need to talk about yesterday. Dad, your sister was very upset. Call your mother. There was no apology in any of it. No acknowledgement that I had been shoved in front of nearly 90 people. I flipped my phone face down on the desk. At 10:12 a.m., another message came in. This time, it was from Tessa. You embarrassed me yesterday. Mom says you owe me an apology before things get worse. I stared at the screen long enough that the words started to blur. For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so complete it felt surreal. Before I could respond, or decide not to, my office door opened. Priya Desai stepped inside carrying a tablet and a slim gray folder. She had been my company's senior financial auditor for almost 4 years, and one of the few people I trusted enough to speak plainly with. She closed the door behind her and leaned against the edge of my desk. You look like you didn't sleep, she said. Family brunch drama, I replied, trying to keep it light. Priya raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, she slid the gray folder across the desk toward me. I was actually coming to talk about something else, she said. Her tone had shifted, calmer, more careful. I opened the folder. Inside were printed transaction logs from the medical staffing agency Tessa ran. I recognized the company account numbers immediately. They were tied to the promissory notes I had funded 3 years earlier. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Priya tapped one line with her pen. Look at the vendor names, she said quietly. I scanned down the page. Healthcare Consulting Group, Logistics Supply Partners, Medical Resource Procurement. They sounded legitimate, but something about them felt off. Do you recognize these? Priya asked. I shook my head. She swiped her tablet and turned it toward me. On the screen were registration records for each of those companies. Every single one had been created within the last 12 months, and every single one listed the same mailing address, a small P.O. box in Wilmington. My stomach sank slowly as the pieces started sliding together. How much? I asked. Priya exhaled. From what we can confirm so far, around 90,000. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Those are fake vendors, she continued. Payments going out of the staffing company into accounts we can't trace yet. I stared down at the numbers again. The transfers were spread out in careful amounts. 5,000 here, 8,000 there, small enough that they wouldn't immediately raise alarms. But together, they told a different story. Someone had been draining money from the business. And because my capital funded the company, that meant the losses ultimately circled back to me. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Does Tessa approve those payments herself? I asked. Priya hesitated. Most of them, yes. She flipped one more page in the folder. And a few, she added carefully, were authorized under power of attorney approval. I looked down. At the bottom of the page was a signature I knew instantly. My mother's. Lauren Whitaker. The realization settled over me in a way that felt heavier than anger. The baby shower scene, the humiliation, the way my mom immediately blamed me. It hadn't just been favoritism, it had been distraction. They needed me quiet. They needed me cooperative. Because the moment I started looking closely at the finances, the entire illusion of Tessa's successful business would collapse. I closed the folder slowly. Across the desk, Priya studied my face. "What do you want to do?" she asked. For a long moment, I didn't answer. Then I turned my phone back over and looked at the latest message from my sister. "Apologize before things get worse." A strange calm settled over me, because for the first time, I realized something important. Things were already worse, and my sister had absolutely no idea what she had just started. The moment Priya left my office, the quiet in the room felt different. Not peaceful, focused. I closed my laptop and pulled the gray folder closer again, reading every page slowly this time. The transactions stretched across almost a year. Small withdrawals disguised as vendor payments, fake consulting invoices, shipping charges for supplies that never appeared in the staffing company's records. It wasn't sloppy. It was systematic. Tessa hadn't just made a few reckless decisions. She had built an entire structure designed to quietly siphon money out of the business while presenting it as normal operating expenses. And my mother had signed off on several of the transfers. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Growing up, my mom always said she hated numbers. She liked to joke that spreadsheets made her cross-eyed. That's why she'd happily let me handle finances for family matters. But those signatures in the folder told a different story. Someone had walked her through exactly what needed to be approved. My phone buzzed again. Mom calling. I let it ring. Then another buzz. Dad calling. Then a third. Tessa. I muted the phone and placed it face down again. For the next 2 hours, Priya and I worked through the financial records together. She pulled additional logs from the payroll processor and flagged unusual cash withdrawals connected to a corporate debit card. Those charges told their own story. Weekend casino visits in Atlantic City, luxury hotel stays, private car services, designer stores. Each purchase had been labeled in the accounting system as client acquisition expenses. I almost admired the creativity. By early afternoon, the pattern was clear enough that we no longer had to speculate. Tessa had been bleeding the company, and my mother had quietly helped authorize the transfers whenever the system flagged them for review. "Lauren," Priya said carefully, "there's something else." She slid her tablet toward me again. This time, it wasn't a vendor record. It was a credit report. 3 separate high-interest loans had been taken out in Tessa's name within the last 9 months. The interest rates were obscene, far beyond what any legitimate bank would offer. The payment deadlines were brutal, and every loan was already overdue. A cold realization began forming. "She's not just stealing for fun," I said slowly. Priya nodded. "Looks like she's trying to stay ahead of something." Outside my office window, traffic moved steadily along Trade Street. People walked between buildings carrying coffee cups, laughing, living completely normal Mondays. Meanwhile, my family's entire financial structure was collapsing in slow motion, and they were still texting me about apologizing. At 3:07 p.m., another message came through from my mother. "We need to resolve this today. Tessa is under a lot of stress." I finally picked up the phone and typed a response. Me. "You're right. We should talk." 3 dots appeared instantly, then disappeared. Then came her reply. "Thank goodness. Come to the townhouse tonight. We'll handle this privately." Privately. Of course. They expected the same routine we'd repeated for years. Sit around the dining table, smooth everything over, maybe ask me to help out one more time to keep the peace. I looked down at the folder again, at the fake companies, the withdrawals, my mother's signature. For the first time in my life, The entire pattern of our family dynamics felt painfully obvious. Tessa caused chaos. My parents rushed to protect her, and I quietly cleaned up the damage. Not this time. I picked up the office phone and dialed a number I hadn't needed in almost 2 years. Marin Shaw answered on the third ring. "Whitaker," she said. "Long time." Marin was a corporate attorney who specialized in contract enforcement. She had helped structure the promissory notes when I first funded Tessa's company, which meant she knew exactly how much leverage those documents carried. "I need to activate the enforcement clauses," I told her. There was a brief pause on the line. "That serious?" she asked. "Yes." I turned my chair toward the window and watched the afternoon sunlight slide between the skyscrapers. "The loan agreements," I continued, "the shareholder conduct clause, and the housing lease tied to my LLC. Marin's voice shifted into full professional focus. "Do you want the formal notices delivered tomorrow?" "Yes," I said. "Morning service?" "First thing." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. "All right," Marin replied. "I'll draft everything tonight." I ended the call and sat quietly for a moment. Across the desk, my phone buzzed again. Tessa. I opened the message. "Mom says you're coming tonight. Good. Fix this." I stared at the screen. Then I typed a single reply. "We'll talk tomorrow." Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the city. And for the first time since that humiliating baby shower, I felt something steadier than anger. Clarity. Because tomorrow morning, my family wasn't going to be having a private conversation. They were going to be receiving legal documents. The confrontation didn't happen at the townhouse like my mother expected. It happened 2 days later in a glass-walled conference room on the 12th floor of my office building. Technically, they weren't invited. They showed up. I was in the middle of reviewing a logistics contract when my assistant knocked quickly and stepped inside. "Lauren," she said carefully, "your parents and your sister are downstairs in the lobby." I looked up from the documents. "Did they have an appointment?" She shook her head. "They're making a scene." That didn't surprise me. Apparently, the courier had delivered the legal notices at exactly 9:15 that morning, just like Marin promised. The documents included the loan acceleration clause, a freeze request on the staffing company's operating accounts, and a 30-day termination notice for the townhouse lease tied to my LLC. By the time my family read the paperwork, the reality they had been avoiding for years finally arrived. I closed the contract folder and stood. "Ask security to bring them up," I said. My assistant blinked. "Are you sure?" "Yes." 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. My father came out first, walking quickly with the tense energy of someone who had rehearsed an argument. My mother followed, clutching her purse with both hands like she was about to attend court. Tessa stormed out last. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot and dark circles sat under her eyes. She looked nothing like the polished entrepreneur she loved presenting on social media. She looked desperate. They barely waited for the receptionist to speak before pushing toward the conference room where I was already sitting. Marin Shaw was seated beside me with a slim laptop open in front of her. A small recording device sat on the center of the table. My parents slowed when they noticed it. "What is this?" my mother demanded. Marin answered calmly. "This meeting is being documented for legal clarity." My father's expression darkened immediately. "Lauren," he said sharply, "turn that off. This is a family discussion." I leaned back in my chair. "No," I said simply. Tessa slammed both hands against the table. "You froze my accounts," she shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I didn't respond right away. Instead, I tapped a button on the remote sitting near my laptop. The projector screen behind me flickered to life. Rows of financial statements appeared, clean, organized, impossible to ignore. Vendor payments, withdrawal logs, casino charges, And finally, a page with 3 large transfers highlighted in red, each one approved with the same signature, Lauren Whitaker. My mother's face drained of color. "Lauren," she whispered. Tessa spun toward her. "You told me that paperwork didn't matter," she snapped. My father stepped forward, raising his voice in the authoritative tone he used whenever he thought he could still control the room. "Enough," he barked. "Lauren, you're blowing this completely out of proportion. If there are accounting mistakes, we'll fix them privately." I looked directly at him. "Those aren't mistakes," I said. Marin clicked another key. The next slide appeared. Corporate vendor registrations. Each fake company connected to the same post office box. Each payment traceable back to the staffing agency's accounts. Each account funded by my capital. The room went silent. My father stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. My mother slowly sank into the nearest chair. But Tessa didn't sit. She leaned across the table toward me, eyes wild. "You don't understand," she said in a strained voice. "I need that money back. Now." "For what?" I asked. She hesitated. Then the words burst out. "There are people expecting payments." Marin folded her hands calmly. "That would be the private lenders listed in the credit reports," she said. Tessa's head snapped toward her. "How do you know about that?" "Because forensic accounting exists," Marin replied. For the first time, real fear flickered across my sister's face. My father turned toward me again. "Lauren," he said more quietly now, "your sister is pregnant. Whatever happened here, you can't just destroy her life over business paperwork." I let that sentence settle in the air for a moment. Then I spoke. She destroyed her own life when she started stealing from the company I funded. My mother finally looked up. "Please," she whispered, "we can still fix this." Marin closed her laptop. "There are 2 options," she said clearly. My father stiffened. "What options?" "First," Marin continued, "Tessa vacates her executive role immediately and signs a repayment agreement acknowledging the debt." Tessa shook her head violently. "I can't repay that." Marin nodded once, which leads to the second option. She slid a thin folder across the table. A full financial fraud report filed with the district attorney's office. My sister stared at the folder like it was a loaded weapon. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother began crying quietly. And for the first time in my life, none of them were looking at me like the person responsible for fixing everything. 3 months have passed since that meeting in the conference room, and my life feels strangely quiet now. Not lonely, just peaceful. The chaos that used to follow every family phone call has disappeared. No more late-night messages asking for emergency transfers. No more emotional speeches about supporting your sister. No more guilt wrapped up as love. Everything finally ended the day Tessa made her decision. She didn't sign the repayment agreement. At first, she tried to stall. Marin gave her 48 hours to review the documents with her own attorney. My parents insisted they would figure something out, which was their usual phrase for hoping I would eventually back down. But the evidence was already too clear. The fraudulent vendors, the falsified invoices, the personal expenses disguised as company costs, and most importantly, the electronic approvals that traced the transactions back to both Tessa and my mother. When the deadline passed without a signature, Marin filed the financial report with the district attorney's office. 2 weeks later, investigators contacted the staffing agency. Another week after that, they contacted Tessa. I didn't attend the interview, but I heard about it later through Marin. Apparently, once the investigators presented the financial records and bank transfers, the conversation shifted very quickly from confusion to legal defense. The charges are still moving through the system, but the list is not small. fraud, financial misappropriation, falsified business documentation. Tessa's lawyer is trying to negotiate a reduced sentence because she's pregnant, but the amount of money involved makes it difficult to minimize. The sister who once bragged about being a self-made entrepreneur now spends most of her days inside a lawyer's office preparing for court. As for my parents, the townhouse situation resolved exactly the way the contract said it would. 30 days after the termination notice, the lease expired. Marin handled the final paperwork, and a property manager supervised the move-out inspection. There was no dramatic confrontation this time, just quiet exhaustion. My parents packed their belongings into a rented truck and left the neighborhood they had spent years pretending was theirs. They now live in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. My father picked up part-time work with a property maintenance company, and my mother has been volunteering at a local church daycare. From what I've heard through extended relatives, they spend a lot of time arguing about how everything went wrong. Sometimes they blame me. Sometimes they blame each other. But more often than not, they blame Tessa. The irony of that isn't lost on me. For most of my life, Tessa was the golden child they defended, no matter what she did. Now that her actions finally produced consequences they couldn't avoid, that protection vanished almost overnight. As for the business, the staffing agency no longer exists. Once the accounts were frozen and the financial investigation began, the remaining clients quietly terminated their contracts. The company dissolved within weeks. I absorbed the financial loss and closed the books. It was expensive. But strangely, it also felt like closing a chapter of my life that had been draining me for years. A month after everything ended, I made another decision. I sold the townhouse. The property had appreciated significantly since I bought it, and the sale price was far higher than the original purchase. Instead of reinvesting it into another family obligation, I used the profit to expand a mentorship program I have been quietly supporting for young women starting small businesses in Charlotte. Women who actually wanted to build something real. Women who understood the difference between opportunity and entitlement. The work has been incredibly fulfilling. For the first time in a long while, my money is helping people who treat it as responsibility instead of a safety net. Every once in a while, I still think back to that baby shower in April. The mimosa soaking through my dress. The shove into the gift table. My mother demanding that I apologize for ruining the moment. At the time, it felt like the worst humiliation of my life. Now I see it differently. That moment forced the truth into the open. It exposed the roles we had all been playing for years. Tessa the favorite, my parents the enablers, and me the silent provider who kept everything running behind the scenes. When the illusion finally broke, everything changed. And the surprising part is that losing that version of my family didn't destroy my life. It gave me something I never had before: freedom. Because sometimes the most important boundary you can set is the one that finally ends the cycle of fixing problems that were never yours to solve in the first place.